Let's shift our focus now from food to something equally essential to 18th century life: taxes. But this isn't just any tax we're talking about. No, we're diving into the world of absurd, downright peculiar taxes that were levied by the French crown during this period. Taxes are hardly ever a fun subject, but you might be surprised by some of the strange ways the monarchy tried to extract money from its citizens. One of the most bizarre taxes imposed during the 18th century was the taxe sur les portes et fenêtres, the tax on doors and windows. At first glance, this tax sounds like something out of a joke, but it was very real, and its implementation was just as strange as the tax itself. The French government, desperate to increase revenue, imposed this tax on homeowners based on the number of doors and windows in their houses. The idea was that the more openings a house had, whether doors, windows, or even skylights, the wealthier its inhabitants must be, and thus, the more they could afford to pay. So, you can imagine the dilemma it created for homeowners. They found themselves in the position of either paying exorbitant fees for each window and door or getting creative to avoid the tax altogether. Some homeowners attempted to minimize the tax by bricking up their windows and doors. Yes, you heard that right, bricking them up. The more windows and doors you had, the higher your tax. So what better way to avoid paying than by sealing them up completely? This led to a rather curious sight in French cities, where homes could often be seen with bricked-up windows, giving buildings an odd, almost half-finished appearance. In some cases, entire floors of houses were sealed off in order to reduce the number of taxable openings. It was as though people were playing a game of architectural hide-and-seek with the taxman, hiding their wealth in plain sight by simply closing it off. And of course, this tax was the source of much public mockery and complaints, as you can imagine. But, of course, this wasn't the only bizarre tax. Another one that stands out is the taxe sur les chiens, the dog tax. Now, taxes on pets are hardly unusual in the modern world. But in 18th century France, taxing your canine companion was a completely different matter. The taxe sur les chiens was implemented in an attempt to limit the number of dogs in cities, particularly in Paris. Dogs, of course, were not just pets in this period. They were also a bit of a nuisance. They roamed the streets in packs, scavenging for food, and could often be seen fighting with one another. But the real reason behind the tax was the fear that dogs were becoming too symbolic of wealth. In a society where the aristocracy was often seen as living in excess, it wasn't enough to simply have a dog. You needed to have the right kind of dog. The government decided to impose a tax on dog ownership, hoping to reduce the number of stray dogs and to discourage the aristocracy from flaunting their wealth by owning multiple animals. But what's even stranger, however, is that the tax wasn't particularly effective in curbing dog ownership. In fact, it may have had the opposite effect. Those with the means to do so simply paid the tax and still had as many dogs as they pleased. It wasn't uncommon for the rich to parade their prize dogs around, showing off their wealth in the form of rare or exotic breeds. But the poor, who often couldn't afford the tax, were left with fewer pets, or more often than not, none at all. The tax, rather than regulating the dog population, only served to further entrench the social divide between the wealthy and the working class. And let's not forget about the taxe sur le sel, the salt tax. This was one of the most hated taxes in French history, and for good reason. Salt was a vital part of daily life, used not just for seasoning food, but also for preserving it, especially in a time when refrigeration was not yet available. Salt was essential for survival, and yet the French crown decided to impose a heavy tax on it. This tax was not just a nuisance. It was a burden on the common people who had little to no access to the salt that was necessary for both cooking and preservation. The salt tax became so unpopular that it sparked widespread protests and unrest, particularly in the regions where people relied on it most. The tax, which had been in place for centuries, was one of the key grievances that led to the French Revolution. In fact, the infamous gabelle, as the salt tax was known, was one of the primary triggers for the unrest in the years leading up to 1789. The common people, already struggling with poverty and hunger, found themselves unable to afford this essential commodity, while the aristocracy could purchase as much salt as they pleased. The tax on salt, in essence, became a symbol of the inequality that plagued French society. What's most interesting about these taxes, however, is how they reflect the mindset of the monarchy. The French crown, in its desperation to finance its lavish lifestyle and constant wars, resorted to taxing virtually every aspect of daily life. The windows in your house, the dogs you kept as pets, the very salt you used to cook your meals, nothing was sacred. The effect of these taxes was to widen the gulf between the rich and the poor, creating a society where the elite could live in excess while the working class struggled just to make ends meet. And yet, these bizarre taxes also provided a way for people to rebel, albeit in subtle ways. Just as with the window tax, the common people found creative methods of avoiding these levies, smuggling salt, hiding their dogs, bricking up their windows, all of which contributed to the rising tension that would eventually give way to revolution, the heart of it. These odd taxes were a reflection of the power imbalance between the monarchy and its subjects. The government, by trying to control every aspect of daily life, was alienating the very people it needed to sustain its rule. But as we'll see, it wasn't just taxation that would bring about change. It was the growing frustration with the monarchy's inability to address the needs of its people.